Here we go. I'm going to finish the chapter on ethics, and we take up with section 7 on Islam. There is no division of ethics and law in Islam, says the Swedish Muslim writer S. Parvez Manzoor. Muslims believe Islamic law is ethical by definition, and what is ethical ought to be enshrined in every nation's laws. Because of this connection between Islamic ethics and law, we suggest you revisit the present section again after reading the law chapter. Historically, Muslims derive their ethics from the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran contains many ethical commands. The Hadith presents Muhammad as the exemplary human whom Muslims must imitate in all respects. Muhammad was only a mortal being commissioned by God to teach the word of God and lead an exemplary life, wrote Islamic scholar Hamuda Abdullati. He stands in history as the best model for man in piety and perfection. He is a living proof of what man can be and of what he can accomplish in the realm of excellence and virtue. Because ethics is based on specific commands revealed from God, we would summarize Islamic ethics as divine command theory. Ram Swarup, the late Hindu thinker and author, articulated how Muslims perceive the actions and judgment of Muhammad, recorded in the Hadith. The prophet is caught, as it were, in the ordinary acts of his life. Sleeping, eating, mating, praying, hating, dispensing justice, planning expeditions, and revenge against his enemies. The picture that emerges is hardly flattering, and one is left wondering why, in the first instance, it was reported at all, and whether it was done by admirers or enemies. One is also left to wonder how the believers, generation after generation, could have found this story so inspiring. The answer is that the Muslim believers are conditioned to look at the whole thing through the eyes of faith. An infidel, in his fundamental misguidance, may find the prophet rather sensual and cruel, and certainly many of the things he did do not conform to ordinary ideas of morality. But the believers look at the whole thing differently. To them, morality derives from the prophet's actions. The moral is whatever he did. Morality does not determine the prophet's actions, but his actions determine and define morality. Muhammad's acts were not ordinary acts. They were Allah's own acts. It was in this way and by this logic that Muhammad's opinions became the dogmas of Islam, and his personal habits and idiosyncrasies became moral imperatives. Allah's commands for all believers in all ages and climes to follow. We might envision Muslims wearing a bracelet stamped with WWMD. What would Muhammad do? This is the only genuinely relevant ethical question in Islam. Why is what Muhammad did so important? Because unlike the Bible, in which God reveals how he is like and what he wants us to do, the Quran presents the God of Islam as not directly knowable. If God's character cannot be known, we must content ourselves with God's decrees, which are most fully revealed in Muhammad. What Muhammad says goes. Abdullati summarized what we can know about God and ethics through the revelation given to Muhammad. The concept of morality in Islam centers around certain basic beliefs and principles. Among these are the following: God is the creator and source of all goodness, truth, and beauty. Man is a responsible, dignified, and honorable agent of his creator. God has put everything in the heavens and the earth in the service of mankind. By his mercy and wisdom, God does not expect the impossible from man or hold him accountable for anything beyond his power, nor does God forbid man to enjoy the good things of life. Moderation, practicality, and balance are the guarantees of high integrity and sound morality. All things are permissible in principle except what is singled out as obligatory, which must be observed, and what is singled out as forbidden, which must be avoided. Man's ultimate responsibility is to God, and his highest goal is the pleasure of his Creator. Required actions include the 5 pillars of Islam discussed in the Islam chapter. Ethical prohibitions including drinking wine, eating pork, animals who kill with claws, teeth, or fangs, birds of prey, rodents, reptiles, worms, and dead animals. Eating meat that has not been properly slaughtered, and gambling. Jihadis may also include as permissible taqiyya, or concealment, lying for the sake of Allah to advance Islam's cause, marriage to multiple wives, and slavery. Muslims are motivated toward ethical behavior from a desire to develop personal virtue and spirituality, to better the state of others, to strengthen relationships, and to anticipate the coming judgment. At the final judgment, all humans will have their deeds weighed in the balance. The Quran says, "Then those whose balance of good deeds is heavy, they will attain salvation, but those whose balance is light will be those who have lost their souls. In hell they will abide." According to Hamuda Abdullati, this world will come to an end someday, and the dead will rise to stand for their final and fair trial. Everything we do in this world, every intention we have, every move we make, every thought we entertain, and every word we say, all are counted and kept in accurate records. On the day of judgment, they will be brought up. People with good records will be generously rewarded and warmly welcomed to the heaven of God, and those with bad records will be punished and cast into hell. However, the Muslim believes that there definitely will be compensation and reward for the good deeds and punishment for the evil ones. That is the day of justice and final settlement of all accounts. Fear of an eternity in hell is a strong motivation for Muslims, especially since one cannot know with certainty what God requires of human souls. At the end of the day, it's straightforward what constitutes ethical behavior for Muslims. Philosophical debates are rare. Standards do not change based on economic conditions. No amount of meditation will move us to higher consciousness. Whether you believe in your heart isn't as important as whether you do your duty. Perhaps in a world of complexity and chaos, it is this straightforwardness that makes Islam attractive to so many. Christianity. Christians say God is not merely a divine rule maker or the keeper of the good. He has made us in his image to be stewards of the earth. But because we are fallen, we live with the dissonance between the way things are and the way they ought to be. Fortunately, though, this is not the end of the story. Through Christ, we gain a means of acting as God desires, as well as a desire to act accordingly. Ethics, then, is not the exercise of our own wills, but the discovery of a God who wills all and has exercised himself on our behalf. The basis of Christian ethics is found in Jesus' instruction to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. This kind of love is derived from a peculiar Greek word, agape. Just as the law of gravity is apparent to anyone who jumps out of an upper story window, the Christian worldview says that what is morally true can be seen by all whose ability to perceive is not completely distorted. Ethics is simply an expansion of a generally revealed moral order. The idea of a moral law is not popular. Those who wish it not to exist or who disagree about its nature are ignoring the truth. Too often the response to the Christian claim is to attack the messenger rather than refute the message. For example, Simon Blackburn, a Cambridge professor and leader in the British Humanist Association, warns against permitting Christian involvement in the public sphere by saying the only reason Christians are not still burning each other is because the secular state stopped them. It is true that many evil things have been done in the name of Christ. So-called Christians have blatantly acted contrary to Christ's message. Christianity even predicts this. Because of sin, people will do evil and often do it under the banner of goodness. In service of truth, they will lie. In the name of compassion, they will torture. To blame God's revelation for this, though, is to confuse the disease with the diagnosis, as one who blames the doctor for having caused the sickness he identifies, or blaming the composer when an unprepared student botches the performance of his music. When a cook ruins dinner, it might be a flaw in the recipe, but more often it is caused by mixing the wrong ingredients in the wrong order or baking them at the wrong temperature for the wrong amount of time. To quote Robert Burns' famous poem, To a Mouse, the best laid schemes of mice and men oft go awry. Muslims believe moral norms are the products of God's decree. Marxists and secularists rely almost exclusively on their economic or naturalistic philosophy to determine ethics. Postmodernists argue for morality based on shared community values, and new spiritualists see ethical behavior as following individually determined inner truth. Christians see moral norms as proceeding from God's nature or character. Francis Schaeffer explained Christianity's uniqueness in this regard. One of the distinctions of the Judeo-Christian God is that not all things are the same to him. This at first may sound rather trivial, but in reality is one of the most profound things one can say about the Judeo-Christian God. He exists. He has a character, and not all things are the same to him. Some things conform to his character, and some are opposed to his character. The task of Christian ethics, then, is to determine what conforms to God's character and what does not. Seeing right and wrong as objectively absolute based on the nature and character of a personal loving God is superior to any concept of moral relativism. Further, Christians understand human beings as free moral agents, as morally culpable, capable of observing God's character and responding, or not responding, in accordance with God's character. Acclaimed French philosopher Luc Ferry says the Christian doctrine of free will, that we have all been given natural gifts and how we use them makes them good or bad, has revolutionized the history of thought. To Jürgen Habermas, one of the world's top philosophers, the Judeo-Christian worldview has produced an ethic incomparable in the history of the world. He says, egalitarian universalism, from which sprang the ideas of freedom and social solidarity, of an autonomous conduct of life and emancipation, of the individual morality of conscience, human rights, and democracy, is the direct heir of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of continual critical appropriation and reinterpretation. To this day, there is no alternative to it, and in light of the current challenges of a post-national constellation, we continue to draw on the substance of this heritage. Everything else is just idle postmodern talk. With some of the world's top philosophers pointing out its virtues, the ethical stance of Christianity is not easily intimidated. At root, though, Christianity's ethics are not complicated. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. And let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Where, according to Christianity, do moral absolutes come from? To say that a particular moral statement can be objectively known is to say that to not know it is to commit an error. And to say that this is the case across all times and cultures is to say that the particular moral statement, such as one ought never torture babies for fun, ought to be universally known. The Bible does not specify these commands line by line. Rather, it gives clear guidelines for moral decision making so we can figure out what is right in the circumstances we face. The most obvious ethical principles, of course, are founded in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, which establish the basic moral law for humanity. Much of Scripture is dedicated to describing God's moral order. For example, the New Testament books of Romans and Galatians contain a number of moral directives for us to follow. The Bible also introduces us to God incarnate, Jesus Christ, and describes his ministry and ethical teachings in an understandable way. The apex of Christ's ethical teaching is found in the Sermon on the Mount, in which his audience realized that he was the role model for virtuous living. Irish historian and political theorist W.E.H. Lecky, who never claimed to be a Christian, admitted the character of Jesus has not only been the highest pattern of virtue, but the strongest incentive to its practice. In fact, The call to follow Jesus is the simplest summation of Christian ethics and at the same time the most difficult thing to do. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Christian who died for his faith at the hands of the Nazis during World War II, noted, "On two separate occasions, Peter received the call, 'Follow me.' It was the first and last word Jesus spoke to his disciple. Christ asks but one thing of all Christians: follow me." By following Christ, we experience how to focus on God's glory. William Young wrote, in declaring by word and deed the perfections, especially the moral perfections of the Most High, man finds true happiness. Carl F. H. Henry described the heart and soul of Christian ethics. Hebrew Christian ethics unequivocally defines moral obligation as man's duty to God. But the use of duty in this sense means much more than checking obedience boxes on some cosmic list. When Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself," he was quoting the Torah, the Old Testament law, re-emphasizing what God had always set down as the proper view of ethics. The first part of Jesus' command, "Love God," shows the insufficiency of deontological or duty-based theories of ethics. The goal is not merely to perform a duty, but to love God with every aspect of our being, heart, soul, mind, and strength. Christianity involves a relationship with a person, not merely a religious responsibility. As for teleological or the consequence-based theories of ethics, we cannot sufficiently fulfill our ethical responsibilities by acting in our own best interests. Only seeking to reflect God's character leads to true flourishing. The second part of Jesus' command applies loving God to loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. There is little room here for a self-definition of human flourishing or personal good, since at its most basic level, loving God means serving others. Carl Henry summarized this teaching. The Apostle John appeals to the explicit teaching of the Redeemer to show the inseparable connection between love of God and love of neighbor. If a man says, "I love God," and hateth his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen? And this commandment have we from him, that he who loveth God loveth his brother also. God is love, and he that dwelleth in love dwelleth in God, and God in him. The love of God is the service of man in love. Jesus said in Mark 10, "Whosoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This ethical stance of servanthood is more than just serving the spiritual needs of others. As Norm Geisler articulates it, it has to do with serving physical needs as well. Man is more than a soul destined for another world. He is also a body living in this world. And as a resident of this time-space continuum, man has physical and social needs which cannot be isolated from spiritual needs. Hence, in order to love man as he is, the whole man, one must exercise a concern about his social needs as well as his spiritual needs. As Christians, our faith in God does not exempt us from worldly concerns such as feeding the hungry or caring for the sick. Jesus tells us in Matthew 25 that when we serve others, we serve him. And when we fail to serve others, we fail to serve him. These ethical guidelines go beyond what we could think up on our own. The human mind, said C.S. Lewis, has no more power of inventing a new value than of imagining a new primary color, or indeed of creating a new sun and a new sky for it to move in. For the Christian, the moral order is as real as the physical order, some would say even more real. The Apostle Paul said the physical order is temporary, but the order not seen is eternal. This eternal moral order reflects the character and nature of God himself. Section 9. The greatest challenge to Christian ethics, in our judgment, comes from the ethical stance secularism, Marxism, and postmodernism promote. If only the natural world may be taken into account, then what is unique and uniquely beneficial about Christian ethics must be set aside. No ethical standards can be known to be absolute. Christians should think long and hard before granting this premise. As Francis Schaeffer insisted, there must be an absolute if there is to be any kind of meaningful moral order. If there is no absolute beyond man's ideas, then there is no final appeal to judge between individuals and groups whose moral judgments conflict. We are merely left with conflicting opinions. The practical Achilles heel of relativism is this: if all we have are conflicting opinions and subjective value judgments, the most powerful will always win, regardless of their rightness. Those who stand outside all judgments of value cannot have any ground for preferring one of their own impulses to another, except the emotional strength of that impulse, wrote C.S. Lewis. Interestingly, there is some movement, even among those of a naturalistic persuasion, to extend beyond purely individualistic, personal autonomy-driven ethical views. In The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt, an atheistic naturalist, describes how his graduate work and several cross-cultural experiences led him to see the inadequacy of the Western idea of a person as an autonomous individual self. Such a view, says Haidt, makes it difficult to make moral decisions and, importantly, to understand how people around the world make such decisions. In response, Haidt examined moral psychologist Richard Schweder's research and found that autonomy is only one reasonable basis for moral decision-making. Community and divinity are also valid. Rather than always starting with the individual, we need to take into account the relationship between people and God's will as legitimate starting points for moral understanding. The idea of the individual as a self-contained autonomous unit is, according to Charles Taylor's massive and acclaimed text, A Secular Age, a relatively recent phenomenon. It is only in the past 500 years or so that people have gotten the sense of a self that is buffered, that a clear boundary exists between self and others. In previous times, in the West and in other nations around the world today, the boundary between the self and other people is porous. We affect one another more than we admit, for good or for ill. Descartes' idea of I think, therefore I am is insufficient, not just because it is philosophically difficult to sustain, but because it begins with I rather than with we or with God. Understanding our obligation to God is the only thing that gets us past relativism. We realize God is truth. Therefore, it is always unlawful and morally wrong for a judge to take a bribe. We understand God is loving. Therefore, it is universally wrong for an adult to sexually abuse a child. If ethical standards are relative to a particular culture, the best we can say is, it is unlawful in the present circumstances to take a bribe or abuse a child. But strict adherence to the law does not fulfill the full duty of the ethical life. Corporations may comply with the law and still act hurtfully. Governments may act within the proper statutes and codes and still afflict the vulnerable. We should never forget, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his letter from the Birmingham jail, that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. Cultural relativism says what is right and wrong depends on the culture. But if this is so, culture is absolute, and those who seek to change it, as did William Wilberforce in seeking to abolish slavery, at best have no grounds for doing so, and at worst are wrong for imposing their views on others. What appear to be exceptions to an absolute rule, such as permission to kill an intruder to protect one's family, or to lie in order to help defeat an evil enemy, do not invalidate the rule, but prove it. When we see a wrong done, we know it is not as it ought to be. That sense of oughtness tells us something of God's law having been placed in our hearts. In conclusion, the Christian ethical system is both like and unlike any other system ever postulated. We must decide now how we will act in response. Dietrich Bonhoeffer asked, "Who stands fast?" Only the man whose final standard is not his reason, his principles, his conscience, his freedom, or his virtue, but who is ready to sacrifice all this when he is called to obedient and responsible action in faith and in exclusive allegiance to God. The responsible man, who tries to make his whole life an answer to the question and call of God. Where are these responsible people? Those willing to raise their hands in response to Bonhoeffer's question ought to be prepared to treat God's moral order with the same respect they show his physical order, to love God with all they are and have, and to treat others as they desire to be treated. Such people must be prepared for a mission to everywhere, to stand firm against tyranny and slavery in the halls of government, as well as sacrifice for the sake of the gospel on the mission field. It is not the extraordinary Christians who do this, but the quite ordinary ones. In putting Christian ethics into practice, believers demonstrate to a watching world that Christ's truth is worth believing and living. We have now invested 3 chapters studying the disciplines of theology, philosophy, and ethics, describing God as creator, redeemer, and sustainer, discussing what is real and how we know, and outlining what the good life consists of. In the next chapter, we will seek to answer 2 questions that to many people are even more basic. What is life, and where did it come from? These 2 questions are the main domain of biology, the study of life. And as we will shortly see, biology is much more than dissections and memorization of terms. It is in the domain of biology that many of the big worldview battles of our day are being fought. The end.